And we are live. Good morning, everybody. It is February 4th, and you are sitting in on Food Safety Chat Live, a live stream that we do every Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain, 7 a.m. if you're on the West Coast, like my friend Brian here, 10 a.m. on the East Coast. I am Brian Armentrout, and I'm the founder of the Food Leadership Group and the Food Safety Foundation, a consulting group that's organized around helping people with FDA compliance for food safety plans and all kinds of fun stuff. And today I'm very happy to bring in a guest that I've wanted on here for quite a while, and that's Bryan Ravich. Good morning, Bryan.
Good morning.
How's things for you? How's the weather in San Diego? Pretty nice.
Well, the weather is, the sun is just starting to come up. I thought it might still be dark when we'd have this presentation, but yeah, it's going to be another beautiful day in paradise, probably 70 degrees and sunny.
Nice. Yeah, if I was going to live in California, San Diego, I would pick San Diego over everything else. I'm in Loveland, Colorado. And so please, everybody, what's fun about the Food Safety Chat is the community we're building around this. And let us know where you're at in the world. I'm always amazed, Brian, where some of the people who listened in on this live stream are from. And what's really cool about this, Stephanie in Germany, good to see you. Tia, good morning and happy belated birthday. Hope you had an awesome birthday. And hopefully Jill didn't embarrass you too much with that announcement on LinkedIn. So I'm always amazed with the different people around the world who check in with us. And if you're new to the Food Safety Chat, what's unique about this and what I think is really cool is this is not a presentation. We're able to bring in experts on particular topics and we have a discussion and we answer your questions. So please, if you have questions around our topic today, throw them in the chat. We'll work them into the conversation as soon as we can. And we love doing this and saying hello to our friends who join us. So Lance in Northern California, nice to see you. Tammy, good to see you as well down in lovely Austin. There's Jill. So here we go. Robert, R-O-B-E-R, hopefully I said that correct, from Egypt. Country I haven't been to is Egypt. I have friends from Egypt and I see pictures and things like this on Facebook. It just looks absolutely gorgeous. I would love to visit like Alexandria and Cairo and go to Egypt, but opportunity hasn't availed itself as of yet, Brian. Before we get started here as well, is I want to, I'm getting better at this, Brian. There we go. Our sponsors up there on the banner, EAS Consulting Group, of which Brian and I both partner with for different projects. And EAS is a consulting company based in DC that works with industry experts with over 20 years of experience. I think, Brian, you and I are both in that category. We checked the box on the 20 years. And what's really cool about EAS is they have experts from just a really wide variety of backgrounds. So I come from industry, manufacturing, and dairy, quality assurance. Brian is from FDA and have a very distinguished career there. And now we're out helping people who need it within the industry. So if you're looking to get things done and you don't want to beat your head against the wall and you're looking for some help, reach out to EAS, talk with Tim Lombardo over there, and he can find the right person to help you. They do an awesome job. And also with the sponsorship here, Brian, as well, is there's a special offer for the training programs that EAS offers as well. And if you stick around to the end, my assistant Renee, who is in the chat as well, will give you a link to that and a special discount code as well. So that's really cool. So we got some really good attendance here. Wow, this is awesome, Brian. Look at all these people. So we got Christy in Tennessee, Megan up in Washington State. It's another pretty area. Everyone international from Georgia. Nice. Corey, of course, gotta love having Corey on here. She always has great questions. And of course, Duncan too. Good to see everybody. So Brian, before we jump in here, first of all, Brian is the owner of BR FDA Consulting Services with a background in FDA. How long were you at FDA, Brian?
About 25 and a half years.
25 and a half. Nice. Good morning, Austin. Austin reminds me too. I didn't normally I give everybody a weather update. So it's been a cold week here in Colorado. So up at my house in Loveland on the north side of the Denver metro area by Fort Collins, we got about at my house probably about 8 to 10 inches of snow. Nice white, powdery, fluffy, easy to scoop snow. So that was good. But last night it got down to around 11 below zero, and this morning when I got up, it was 2 below zero. So a little different than San Diego for sure. Michael, good morning, and James, good morning as well. I'm not sure where Madera, California is, Brian. Do you know where that is? Madera?
I'm thinking it's around the San Francisco area,
Yeah, I
probably
bet you're right.
about halfway up.
Yeah, James, if you don't mind, yeah, throw that in the chat and let us know where that's at. That sounds like a really cool location. So one of the things, Brian, that I always do every single week is I always forget. Everybody grab your favorite beverage. I have coffee and Brian does as well. That's a really cool mug. I love that. Oh my goodness, the slugs.
This is the UC Santa Cruz. Got to get it in there.
I love that. That is too awesome. Everybody join us for a drink this morning. That's some good coffee.
I don't know how it happened, but their mascot is the banana slug.
That's right. It's like when they had that contest in England with naming the boat, and the one that won was Boaty McBoatface, and then they're like, no, we're not. You guys are nuts. We're not doing that. But whoever came up with banana slugs had enough pull to get that done. So kudos to them. So, oh boy, man, we got a lot to cover here. So let's dive right in here. This is a topic, Brian, that I've been wanting to do for a long time: foreign supplier verification, which is super important under FSMA. And when you really look at it, okay, yep. So by Fresno, gotcha, James. Thank you. Foreign supplier verification, really, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Brian. You're playing inside ball on these type of things, but really one of the genesis and one of the causes of Foreign Supplier Modernization Act and Foreign Supplier Verification was a lot of these issues that were happening at the time, now over a decade ago, with imports. So we were getting in some dicey things from China. There was product that was contaminated with melamine. People's pets were getting kidney disease and dying, and then they figured out what was going on, and people were mad. People were mad at the time. And so,
yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, not only that, but I think the most important aspect is putting the responsibility on the people that import these products into the United States. And until this regulation went into effect, except for seafood, which kind of started this whole idea of some sort of verification activity for the importer. So it's an interesting process, but this is a for sure way to put that responsibility on the importer.
Yeah, exactly. I think when this all came about, it was FDA's chance to really go and strengthen up areas that they'd been concerned about, to your point. And you were on the FDA side. I was on the industry side at that time, and I was part of a working group with, at the time, the Grocery Manufacturers Association, helping to put together recommendations from industry relative to foreign supplier verification. So I got to see that mechanism as well too. So I've been involved with FSVP for quite a while. One of the things I think that people don't realize, and so we'll kind of start with the basics here, is you have in the Code of Federal Regulations, you have different sections that apply for different food products. So 21 CFR 117, 111, et cetera. But FSVP is in a completely different section, isn't it?
It's found under the import section, actually. It's
like 1.5.
Way in the beginning of the regulation. They assigned it 1.500, so it's almost in the beginning of the CFRs.
Exactly. And I think for a bit of context for everybody on this too, when FDA created the regs around this too, I think they were pretty generous around educating the industry. And I know that officials within FDA spent a whole lot of time, yourself included, going around and talking with groups and going to conferences and giving everybody an overview of what this actually meant for them. And the phrase, we all heard this quite a bit, right? Educate before we regulate. Now, and of course they would throw the caveat, if we see something that's egregious and a threat to food safety, we're going to act. But we want to make sure that the industry understands what's going on out there. And a few years ago, when FDA started going out and giving presentations, that tone changed. And FDA started saying, okay, we're going to start, really paying attention to this. And I did some research here about a month ago or so and pulled up the most recent data from FDA on 2020 for observations from FDA. And the number one, by far, the number one source of observations with FDA was foreign supplier verification. They had over 500 notifications. And the number 2 spot on that list, Brian, was like hazard, improper hazard analysis. So FSVP had over 500, hazard analysis had 100, and then it kind of tailed off from there. So FDA is definitely ramping up their activity around FSVP.
Yeah, that's for sure. I'd like to just digress just for a second so people could understand my responsibility while I was working with FDA. So when FSMA was first signed into law, 2011, hard to believe, 10 years have gone by. FSMA's been in place for 10 years now. I was asked to participate in the design and the implementation of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So it was an interesting situation because I actually worked on this project from the beginning. It was on paper, and that's really all we had. The other thing that's quite interesting too, and you had mentioned, all of these laws are passed by Congress. And if you look at the Foreign Supplier Verification, the act itself that was written by Congress, it's only about 2.5 pages long. Oh. And then it gives the FDA the authority to actually write the regulation. So you had mentioned about industry. One of the important documents is the Federal Register, the actual final document of the regulation, where we actually went back and answered questions like from some of the organizations that you represented and from people around the world about FSVP. There were probably between 400 and 500 different questions that we answered within that document. So sometimes if you're trying to figure out why you have to do something this way or that way, a lot of times you can find the answers there. Mm-hmm. So it's a handy document.
No, and that's a really good point, Brian. So I think just as a quick refresher for people, a lot of people don't understand that, is that Congress passes a law and says, okay, we charge FDA with enforcing this law, and then they vote on it, and then the law passes and the president signs it. Well, now FDA, to your point, Brian, has a 2-page document that doesn't say how to do anything. It just says you need to do this, and it sets deadlines and all kinds of stuff, and puts rules in place for FDA, and then FDA's got to write regulations to then create enforcement programs for that law. And as part of that process, I think FDA does a good job with this, and this is where I think the U.S. government has a good mechanism in place. Is FDA then goes out and works with industry through trade groups and things like this, like I mentioned before, to get feedback and say, okay, if we're going to do this, tell us some of the things that we need to be looking at. And then once that's created, it goes out and is posted, and then people can give feedback and ask questions, and there's a comment period before it becomes finalized. And also FDA will create guidance documents as well. And they're non-binding, but they also give insight into that regulation as well. And to your comment too, the questions are a good insight into FDA's thinking, what they were doing as well. Because a lot of times, right, especially Brian, when you're talking at importation, I mean, thousands and thousands of companies who are bringing in, times 100 different products into the country. Right. All kinds of variables and permutations of all these different things that are going on. And one of the things that we worked really closely to make sure that FDA understood when, as industry, we were talking with FDA on this, is that the knowledge and the risk associated with a particular item that's being imported is based upon the end usage, not necessarily the product itself. And I remember FDA kind of looked at me like this when I said that. And I went, okay, it's like this. Let's say we have a non-fat dry milk manufacturer who's importing product into the US. And it's actually the risk of that material is going to be based on the end use. So if you're going to put that in a dairy product, or if you're going to put that in infant formula or pet food, the hazard analysis, the end point of use is going to be different. And the users are going to be concerned with different things. And the system, whatever we develop from the regulations, needs to take that into account. And I think FDA did a great job of taking that feedback and incorporating that into the regs.
And they did. Real fast, some of the regulation is divided into different areas that people are probably familiar with. One of the things that'll be interesting with this discussion today, this isn't about how to create a FSVP plan, so to speak. This is more of the background, the regulations, a little bit about enforcement and how this whole regulation is working right now for the FDA. But one of the things that you had mentioned about the end use is an interesting situation, because there is a specific section where if it's an ingredient, it's handled differently than if it would be a finished product. And a lot of the importations are for further processing, where then it's going to be under preventive control. And under preventive control, we all know about Subpart G and the supply chain, which they actually have a kind of the same program in place as a domestic manufacturer as what FSVP is. However, the only exception to that is every one of these food entries have to be identified at the time of entry, along with who is the FSVP importer, which is always an interesting question. Because a lot of people, when you think about imports, you think about the importer of record, which is a customs term. And they're usually the person that is in charge or overseeing the importation, but that's not necessarily the FSVP importer. So sometimes there can be confusion as to, are you actually the FSVP importer? Often a customs house broker will put anybody down, and FDA will knock on their door or give them a call. And the first question they ask is, are you the FSVP importer? That's the first thing you have to really straighten out, because a lot of times with these inspections, they're going to find that the person that we're knocking on that door isn't actually the FSVP importer. So it's an interesting task.
And I think that's probably where, Brian, a lot of the observations that FDA is writing up comes from, is because people don't understand how this works. And the presentation I saw from FDA, Sharon Mail had mentioned that, saying that, hey guys, listen, you need to understand this and get this correct, because if you send FDA and utilize resources going to locations where product doesn't even exist, we're going to be frustrated and not happy about that. Human nature, and she's absolutely right. Corey asked a question here. Is it just me, or have recent inspections halted a bit in 2022? I've noticed significantly fewer inquiries with my consulting biz. So definitely with COVID, right? We saw a dip. From what I've seen so far, 2022 is kind of turning around. But Brian, you shared with me something that I wasn't aware of relative to FSVP questioning from FDA. So why don't you kind of tell everybody a little about this process they're doing now?
Well, one of the things, I just recently had a chat with an ex-employee at FDA, and things are still the same as far as individuals getting out to conduct inspections, to collect samples. It's really mission critical still. Of course, if there's an outbreak, we're still doing, and I have to apologize, it's hard to remove myself from FDA. I often refer to myself as if I'm still in the agency. But things have pretty much halted, except there was the vaccines, and there were the masks coming in, and then there was all of the sanitizers, which some of that became a big importing mess. But basically inspections had stopped. But with FSVP, they actually wrote within the regulation, not knowing exactly when or how it would be used, that they could request in writing that the documents be sent to FDA, and these inspections could be conducted remotely, which is something that is quite unusual. There are some other circumstances with medical devices where documentation and information is supplied ahead of time. But outside of that, the agency never conducted inspections remotely. And so with this program, it's really FSVP that's taken the spotlight. I think in the beginning, the agency looked at this as kind of another one of these importing programs that really doesn't have a lot of significance. But as soon as COVID hit, so one of the things that they can do with FSVP is they can identify these entries. They have databases of everything. They can put in, for instance, if in 2000, the agency was scheduled to go to a firm in Germany and do a random inspection there. Now what they did was they just looked at that firm to see who is the FSVP importer for that firm, and then went to that FSVP importer, conducted an inspection, looking at a hazard analysis and making a, kind of abbreviated situation of how that firm is doing. So they kind of changed a little bit of how they were looking at conducting these inspections. So it was interesting. It became an interesting tool. Another thing that's, outside of the realm of people outside of the agency, everything the agency does is looked upon by Congress. And even during this time of COVID, they have to justify their income. So they have to go to Congress and show them that they're still conducting inspections. And these 2,000 plus inspections over the last couple of years for FSVP has brought those numbers up because it's still considered a domestic inspection.
Wow, interesting. So I want to make sure that everybody caught that, because that's really, really important, and something that we need to emphasize here is FDA has modified their approach just like us, right? We're doing a lot of Zoom meetings and not traveling as much, right? FDA is in the same boat. So a lot of FSVP inspections are being done remotely, right? And people are being written up because FDA, picks up the phone and calls somebody and says, "Hi, we're doing an FSVP inspection. We want to see your plan. We want to see your hazard analysis. We want to see your importation plans." And people are like, "What are you talking about?" And out comes the pen from FDA, right? And people are getting written up for that because they don't know that they need to do this.
And it's interesting too, because again, when you look at behind the scenes, is it legal? At FDA, a lot of things that we were doing with FSVP were being cleared by the Office of Chief Counsel. So they would have to go and they would have to discuss and come up with these strategies. For instance, you can't conduct an inspection without giving a notice for inspection. So how do you know that that notice of inspection has been received by the person remotely? Because before you can obtain the documentation, you have to be served. So they came up with a process to ensure that these people would be served. And the same thing when you talked about 483 items, it's a legal document. That's the basis of more regulatory action. If you are served with, and in the case of FSVP, it's actually called a 483A. It's a little bit different form than we would typically use for a regular inspection, because there was verbiage on the regular 483 that didn't apply to FSVP. For instance, an FSVP importer can be a grocery store, the owner of a grocery store, which is typically not a place that FDA would inspect. That's done by local or state regulators. But still they fall under, and restaurant owners, they can be FSVP importers. Ooh. So these are entities that are outside of the realm of the type of people that would typically be inspected.
Yeah. So if I'm an importer in Florida and I have an importation business and I'm bringing in jars of sun-dried tomatoes from Italy, I'm an FSV importer.
You certainly are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's responsibilities with that. And I think there was a lot of difficulty, a lot of grief in the brokerage business because I don't think a lot of them understood their new responsibilities. And I think a lot of them probably still don't.
Well, it's interesting too, because under the food firm registration, which in some cases the FSVP importer isn't required to have that registration, but a lot of brokers in the industry were putting themselves as the U.S. agent under that situation. But then the term U.S. agent has kind of morphed into something bigger and more responsibility. And in some cases, the U.S. agent can actually be the responsible party and could find themselves on an import alert or having warning letters where that responsibility becomes something that you have to look at and make sure that the person that's been assigned as a U.S. agent really wants that responsibility.
Yeah, I don't think I would.
Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the things here, guys, Brian has given us a ton of resources for this, and one of the main ones, and Renee, if you can put this in the chat, FDA put together a real nice summary of the key FSVP requirements, and that's link number 2, Renee, if we can throw that in the chat. And of course, our emails are here. If you want some additional information, please reach out to us. We're both very readily, and we want to help on these type of things. But I think this is a nice summary to kind of walk through. And I actually recently did an example with this, Brian, with one of my clients.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a client, we were looking at our hazard analysis, and we were building out their food safety plan. And these guys buy honey. And so, okay. And so if you look at the guidance document from FDA for your hazard analysis, Appendix 1, right, which lists some of the recommendations FDA has around biological, chemical, and physical threats. For biological, one of the threats that they associate with honey is, of course, Clostridium botulinum. There's a potential for that. And this is why, for example, you never feed honey to little babies, because if there's any toxin present in that honey from the spores when they germinate, that the baby's body is not ready and not able to really fend that off. So it can, really affect the nervous system, and the toxins can, impact the baby. And so you never give honey to babies. But we were buying honey from a company in the US, and we're working on our hazard analysis, and they were importing this honey from Brazil. And so we needed to understand what they were doing to managing the risks associated with as part of their programs. So we contacted them, had a conference call, went over their programs, their evaluations, their testing, how they were mitigating the risks, all these type of things, so that we could understand that for our hazard analysis for our system, because they need to understand that too, because FDA can show up at our facility and ask for this information on our foreign suppliers. They can for this honey company as well. So getting a good understanding in a lot of cases, Brian, just talking with your suppliers and working through these type of things is extremely beneficial. And I think, and the reason I brought up that honey is working through this guidance document from FDA that you supplied. It's kind of a good example, right? Because that's the process we went through. So this company's a food manufacturer, so they're covered under the rule. Now, there are carve-outs for other industries, as you'd mentioned earlier, Brian, depending upon what you're doing. So there's, juice HACCP and seafood and LACF, low acid canned foods, other regulations that were already in existence that address a lot of these things. And FDA said, okay, that's fine. Those agencies can and those regulations can follow their existing rules. USDA, right, has their own rules relative to these things. So you need to understand if you're actually covered by this. So in that honey example, yes, we're covered. Mm-hmm. And so the next step as you're going through this document then, Brian, is looking at the hazards. So your physical, biological, and chemical hazards with honey. So honey has chemical hazards as well. So certain markets around the world, they'll treat the bees with antibiotics, chloramphenicol. And there have been recalls associated with that. And you need to be aware of those things. Food fraud with honey. There are elements around the world so that produce honey and then ship those through secondary markets to the US. You need to be aware of those type of things. So there's a lot of legwork relative to the importation of that product. And you then need to develop your foreign supplier verification program. And when you determine these hazards, figuring out who controls them, right?
Yeah, it is an interesting process. I would like to go back to the comment that you made of actually conducting the hazard analysis. One of the other things that I didn't mention is I also helped to design the training course for the investigators that are conducting these inspections. Prior to me retiring, I was present for each and every class that was taught. And one of the things that's interesting when you look at hazards and hazard analysis, the FDA, one of the things that the investigators are taught to do is to actually conduct a pre-hazard analysis themselves. So what they have is an entry number. And I don't know how familiar, maybe that's a discussion for another day, but there's an industry code, and then there's also how the product is packaged. So of course, by looking at that product code, you can make some assumptions. For instance, the product code's going to identify if it's in a vacuum or modified packaging. And with that, you're going to have a whole nother set of different hazards that could occur because of refrigeration and everything else that's involved.
Yeah.
But there's also this aspect of you can have the same product coming in from two different areas. And one of the examples I used in the training class was rice. And it's interesting because you think rice is being so simple. In Thailand, I was at a rice manufacturer that rice, about 30% moisture has to be reduced. And in some places around the world, for instance, in Thailand, they're using big machinery to actually dry the rice. But in other places in the country, it's just laid out on cement, where now you might have heavy metals. You might have other pathogens of birds. Exactly. We know what happened with birds and peanut butter. So, it's an interesting situation. The other thing, from an FDA perspective, we only have this product code. So if you have a product code like an 03 is a baked good from that industry, but you don't know if it's gluten-free. If it's gluten-free, if it's being made with rice and it's a bread, you don't have an allergen problem. But on the other hand, if it's made with gluten, you have to identify within your hazard analysis as a chemical hazard allergen. So it's trying for the investigator, because they come up with a hazard analysis, and then what they're supposed to do is compare it to the hazard analysis that the person being inspected has. You have more hazards, you could have less hazards, or you may have the same hazards. But like what happened with you and honey, under some circumstances, you may identify things that FDA hadn't. Or there's situations where you may not have to identify Staph aureus because it's just not something that's going to happen in the process that's being done overseas.
Exactly. So, and I think too, what people forget about in this as well too, is that this is all facility based, right? So you are approving a foreign supplier manufacturing location, not a foreign supplier, right? So in that honey example, if I have a client who's buying honey through a company in the US who's bringing that honey in from Brazil, the manufacturing locations in Brazil need to be qualified by that honey importer. They need to go through and say, okay, we have looked at the hazard analysis and we have approved these particular facilities. If you add a new facility, you have to go through that process with that new facility as well. And these need to be updated at least every 3 years. And if something changes in the process, you need to update it more frequently. Let's see. So we have some questions here. So Kristen, good morning. Had a good question here. What about packaging? So primary packaging, yes, absolutely, right? So correct me if I'm wrong on this, Brian, but pretty much for ingredients and primary packaging, so packaging that comes into contact with the food, FDA's view on this is it's essentially food now, right?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting situation because, and it goes so much further than that. It goes to the machinery that's being used and the belts, because that becomes a food substance or a food contact substance. And actually what they've done with that, and it's already been 10 years now, so I doubt that it's going to come back. And that has to do with like plates and silverware are actually considered food because it's a vessel that holds food and transfers the food. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. And there was also other exceptions that they made. There was like live animals being imported into the United States. So of course that was exempt if they were going to be used for food. And probably everybody knows this, but FDA does regulate some of the exotic meats. So USDA does the ordinary meats, where FDA would do unusual meats that are like snakes and lizards and
Really? I didn't know that.
imported insects come in quite frequently. I was just looking at the import alert, and one of the people that are on import alert, there's a whole bunch of fried and dried insects that were imported into the United States. Like you said, there's just hundreds and thousands of different types of foods that come into the United States from all over the world.
Yep, absolutely. Elise has a couple of good comments here, and thank you for adding these. So for FSVP, it's really important that to ensure your brokers are inputting the correct info in the codes. Absolutely. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I had an audit on a sample because the broker defaulted to the FSVP importer for all products being imported instead of entering R&D evaluation. So there's different codes that you can enter. There was an exemption for a while if you didn't have a code, UNK unknown, but that is gone. That's no longer allowed. Following up on Elisa's train of thought here, interestingly enough, I was told, same one. Let's see, import and distribute. I was told by an importer and distributor was still responsible to input into the RFR, the Reportable Food Registry, in the event of discovering a hazard, a virtually holding product, even though not required to register in the FFR. Wow, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that's all about.
Yeah, so if there's a hazard, so the Recordable Food Registry is used in the US, just for everybody's benefit here, right? So if I'm a food manufacturer and I have a potential recall event, a class 1 situation in my products, I need to go into the Reportable Food Registry and enter the information in there so that FDA is aware of that. Side note on that as well, just a little tip here if you're working in industry, know your regional FDA offices and who's working in those offices and the different divisions ahead of time. And if you put something into the RFR, reach out to FDA in that district and give them a heads up, right? So that you're just not relying on that email. Develop that relationship with those guys. That's important. So let's see. So Renee put in the information for the hazard analysis. Thank you. Duncan has a question. How easy or difficult is it in general to administrate this level of supplier and raw material information for food manufacturers? It's not easy. It's not easy, right? So, and it gets even more complicated. Let's say, for example, you're a food manufacturer. So I ran quality assurance at White Wave Foods, and we had 18 plants and 40 co-packers. And those co-packers, in some instances, were manufacturing products on our behalf, and they were purchasing the materials themselves. And so they were bringing them in. So let's say, for example, you have base materials that weren't necessarily specific to your products. Let's say sugar or things like this. Those were being managed and purchased through those co-mans. They're responsible, if they're importing those products, to have those. But that was my brand, right? So I need to have a very close understanding of how they were managing the food safety plans and what they were doing under foreign supplier verification. So I had my quality people keeping a really close eye on that information.
Yeah, that's it can be difficult. I mean, on my side now that I'm a consultant and I have done some of these FSVP plans, it's really up to the FSVP importer to obtain the documentation that we need, and they have to have a working relationship. One of the things that we talked about, and it was interesting because there's product out there, and in some cases it's not considered under FSVP. But for instance, the situation is if you go to a supplier here in the United States that can supply you with, let's say, olive oil, and you don't necessarily know where that olive oil is coming from. You might have a specification and you are requesting a specific product, but it may be made by 7 different manufacturers in Italy. And what becomes challenging is you're actually the FSVP importer because you have an agreement. There's an invoice that's been cut, and this has been ordered under your behalf, which makes you the FSVP importer, but you don't necessarily know who it's coming from. And then you have to go back to your supplier and ask them for this critical information. And if they disclose who the manufacturer is, the next time you order, you may just go directly to that manufacturer in Italy with cutting out that middleman. And there was a lot of discussion on that. And it's still, it's still happening. And it's a hard situation. So in some cases, the actual manufacturer can't be identified. In other situations, it may be easier to buy it as a domestic product and just have your supplier be the FSVP importer. And a lot of people have taken on that responsibility. There's people in Canada that have opened what they call straw businesses in the United States, which they act as their own importer and then kind of sell the product domestically once it's already been entered.
I see. So then they're the listed entity. Interesting. So you have your hazard analysis. You need to look at the risk. And so that's like your normal chemical, physical, and biological, but also, are there any actions against that company? Have there been any import alerts? Have there been any recalls? And there's different resources out there to gather this information as well.
And FDA did a good job. We worked together. In the past, you could look these things up, but you would look them up one at a time. I mean, you can go to the import alert, and it's actually, they've been doing a good job changing it over. It was really hard to identify and find a specific firm. You would kind of have to just scroll through them to see if you can find the firm or not. But they have a resource site now where you can literally put the foreign supplier's name in, and everything will come up under that. I believe I hope I gave that website to Renee. If not, we could maybe post that later where you can find that.
Looking at the list here.
Simple database by just putting the name. If nothing comes up, then you know that we would probably consider that to be that they're in good standards with FDA. You wouldn't see any warning letter. You wouldn't see that there's any import alerts or refusals on their behalf. So things like that.
There's a document on the list that you sent over, Brian, FSVP list of participants. Would that be it?
No, that was another interesting thing in the law. When Congress passed it, they said under FSVP, which we all felt that they were really talking about VQIP, which is a whole different program, that the people should be listed who are qualified to be in that program. But instead, this was to identify all FSVP importers. And if you look at that website and go to that list, it's like hundreds of pages long. And it's every FSVP importer that it has imported for a quarter.
Wow.
So they change the list quarterly.
So
Otherwise, it would have been just so long. It would have been very, very difficult. And because Congress never said what needed to be on the list, there's only a name and their home state. And that's the only information that's there. But people can go and it's alphabetical and they could see if their name is there. Somebody had asked about kind of like fraud in the program. Like we had talked before that the broker can enter a code that's an exception code. For instance, it's interesting. Let's just talk about salt. If salt is coming into the country to be put on roads, it's not regulated by FDA. We all know that. But if salt's coming into the country as an ingredient, either a table salt, then it's under FSVP. But if that same salt is coming in for a brine, for a manufactured smoked fish, then it's not under FSVP and can be exempt, because even the ingredients used in fish would be exempt from FSVP. And so it's very easy to put exemptions down, but it's also easy for FDA to look at brokers and see how many brokers are identifying products that should maybe be under FSVP, but they're exempting them. And then FDA can knock on the broker's door and ask to see all the documentation for those entries to make a determination. And if there is fraud going on, then it's a situation where they can be referred to United States Customs under their laws. And some of these are, criminal acts that people can get in a lot of trouble for.
Wow. A person here, Alexander, asked about furls. Does that apply? What is furls? Federal, so FDA United Registration and Listing System for like LACF. Okay.
Yeah, it's the database that's used. Again, it's not so applicable to FSVP, but earlier Brian and I were talking, and maybe imports would be a good topic someday for a chat to better understand the whole importation system. I would like to, before we run out of too much time, I had just jotted a few notes, and it was interesting. As FSVP was being developed, there was kind of a power struggle. First of all, because we think of FSVP as being foreign and it has to do with the importation of foods, it would be natural that this would be under the import system. There's actually a division within FDA that just handles imports. But in the past, imports have never been utilized to oversee an assignment or a program. Now, what they do is there's a whole bunch of people that look at entries and take samples and sometimes engage in inspections, but very infrequently. It's mostly about taking samples. So at the same time, what was happening is these FSVP inspections, no matter what people think, these are domestic inspections with domestic enforcement behind them. And what I mean by that is and you can see by the numbers, there's classifications of inspections where it looks like the last data that I pulled up, since 2017, there's been over 2,000 inspections, of which almost all of them, except for a very small percent, have been what they would classify as VAI, which is voluntary action indicated. There's also a classification of OAI, which is official action indicated. Usually, if you're in violation of a critical situation within the regulation, it would be official action. The reason they didn't want to accept official action is there's guidelines that the inspection would have to be reconducted within a certain timeline. And if you classify them as VAI, you have a longer time to have some voluntary action done by the importer to hopefully nudge him enough to move forward to have an FSVP put into place. But a lot of people are then having second inspections to ensure that they've done what they should, and they're still not in compliance with the regulation. And then at that time, after conducting 2 inspections, legally, they can get a warning letter. With that warning letter, if they don't respond adequately, they can then be placed on an import alert, which is no different than being enjoined or an injunction, meaning you can't import into the United States anymore. Essentially, your living is, you know, it's on hold. You're stopped from conducting business. So
that's right. So it's kind of analogous to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to say, I don't believe that people are looking at this as serious as it can be.
And definitely FDA's attention has turned to this, right? So if you're a US manufacturer and you're relying on foreign suppliers and all of a sudden they're not doing these things correctly and you don't understand what's required to bring these products into the US, you could find your supply chain cut off really quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, people, it's an interesting situation. And the thing is, to go back to this being a domestic program, but it has the teeth of imports. And again, an interesting situation is if you're on that import alert, many import alerts are based on sampling. So if you had salmonella in a product, you can still bring that product into the United States, but it's your responsibility to have it analyzed and ensure that it's not adulterated. But with FSVP, if you're on that list, it's not easy to get off that list. Now you have to prove, you have to give them all their documentation that they need, but now you're under the microscope. So if anything is incorrect, you're not going to get off that import alert. And the other thing that people might not think about is if you only have one supplier and you're a foreign entity that ships into the United States and that supplier gets put on to import alert, you don't have a way to bring your product into the country until you can develop a new source of a supply chain to bring it in through some other entity. And it's interesting too, because once you're on import alert, that doesn't mean that the product's adulterated. That just means you as the FSVP importer can't conduct business. The foreign supplier can still bring his product in, but it can't be through you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's kind of bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level. So clearly, right, this is an important part to your business. And what we wanted to do today with Brian's expertise is kind of give everybody a little refresher around foreign supplier verification and the impact this can have on your business, which is huge. And FDA is paying a lot of attention to compliance to foreign supplier verification. They've been talking about it, they've been warning about it, and now they're enforcing it. So all of these requirements need to be in place. So the bottom line, if you're a manufacturer, you need to understand your supply chain. You need to understand who's doing what. You need to understand what the risks are, who's controlling those, what are the corrective actions, what's exempt, what's in play, how this documentation is taking place, so that when FDA knocks on your door and says, hi, according to our records, these materials are being brought in through this customs and brokerage company, and we're here to look at your foreign supplier verification program, you can have a conversation. Because if you don't have that information, you're in a lot of trouble. So you don't want that to happen to your business. So on that side, one of the things that's really useful as well is taking courses on this. And put in the comments here, guys, if you'd like us to do more of a deep dive into around some of these elements of foreign supplier verification and have Brian back on, let me know, because I think it would be worthwhile to spend an additional hour or so in the future really going into some specific conversations around foreign supplier verification, because we didn't talk at all about how you go in and you need to register your products going in through Customs and Border Protection and the codes and all these importation requirements that you need that let FDA know what's going on with your products coming in. So look at training courses out there. And as I had mentioned, EAS has some fantastic training courses you can take online, or you can have people brought in to do training in your company as well. And if you, let's see if I can do this here correctly. There we go. Awesome. So if you go to easconsultinggroup.com/training, you can look at the courses that EAS has available. And EAS has also generously made available through this food safety chat a special discount code. So when you're checking out for the course, in the promo field, if you put Brian with a Y, so spelled correctly, not with an I like the other Brian here. If you put BRYA in, and I don't think it's case sensitive, if you put that in at checkout, you get an extra 15% off, which is awesome. So I really appreciate EAS doing that for us. So in closing, locals group. I almost forgot about the locals group. I think, so Renee will put that in here as well too. So we put together a group in locals, which is a new platform out there, which is free. You can join, and I send out updates on what's going on in the world of food safety. There's also a membership site where you can gain access to additional information. So postings and live streams and talks like this where you can rewatch these. And so it's a really cool little resource out there if you're interested in joining that as well. So as we kind of close out our conversation today, which went way too fast, Brian, any closing thoughts for everybody who's watching today?
One of the things, we didn't talk about the regulations at all, or how to put together a FSVP plan. But one of the things that we would teach our investigators at FDA is to look at the regulation almost as a recipe, like you're baking a cake. And, like you just have to look for buzzwords too within the regulation. When you see that something needs to be in writing, then that's going to be a document. That's going to be something that you need to have with the regulation. So hopefully we'll be able to spend some time maybe talking more about the regulation. The time does go fast, but
well, and that's a good point, Brian, is don't beat your head against the wall trying to figure out this stuff all on your own. So Brian's email is on here. So ravageb@gmail.com. I mean, work with an expert like Brian who can help you develop that food safety plan, your foreign supplier verification plan, and put together that recipe so that when FDA does show up, right, because it's only a matter of time, right? So when they do show up, you have the things in place and you're prepared, and FDA is going to walk in and say, okay, these guys know what they're doing. Don't waste your time, right? Bring in an expert to help out with these things. So thank you, Wallison, for the comment there. Great. Appreciate that. We enjoy doing these, and this wouldn't be possible at all. And I don't think we'd have as much fun if it wasn't for you guys for joining us. So thank you again for making this interactive. We always enjoy these conversations. Raphael always has great things to say in here. So thank you very much. And we will be back here again next Friday. So February 11th at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern for our next food safety chat. And again, we go live, and this is available on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. So again, Brian, thank you for joining us today. You're an amazing resource, and really glad that I got to know you and work with you. And please, if you need help on FSVP, reach out to Brian. He'd be happy to help you.
Yeah, anybody, if you have questions, I'll have to go through some of these questions. My email's here. Feel free to email me. I'll be happy to talk to you. The other, just one piece of information, if you're an importer, an FSVP importer, and you do get a notification from FDA and you don't have an FSVP in place, don't respond to FDA. Find somebody that can help you and put together a plan, and hopefully you can get through this inspection You know, all FDA wants is to be in compliance. So however you do that, you know, it's up to you, but it is important as an importer to understand the product that you're bringing in. A lot of these can be very, very harmful. And as we've all seen with recalls and outbreaks, you know, it's important to understand the type of product you're bringing in, how to handle it, and things like that. So it is an important aspect.
Perfect. All right. Awesome, everybody. We're out of time, so we're going to close out the chat here today. And again, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you back here next Friday. Thanks again, Brian, and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye, Brian.
Bye, everyone.